Well, hello and welcome, everybody. I'm Sally Allen. I'm the Executive Director of the Livermore Lab Foundation. I'm so delighted to be with you all this afternoon for a wonderful discussion and retrospect from 9 leaders of Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. As you know, this year marks the 70th anniversary of the lab, 7 decades of making the impossible possible, taking on grand challenges and serving our nation. Indeed, Livermore is a place where science truly matters. Thanks to our laboratory directors, we'll hear about some of those top accomplishments today, as well as their opinions on the future. How do we envision the next 30 years at Livermore? What new ideas and innovations and accomplishments might be front and center then? With more than 200 in attendance today, we know this gathering is also a way for you to reconnect and reminisce, and our foundation is so pleased to provide this opportunity. For those of you who may not be familiar with the Livermore Lab Foundation, you can learn a little bit more about us on page 15 of your programs. I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge some of our founding board members with us today who started this journey back in 2016, helping to identify philanthropic opportunities and foundational support for the science and research innovations and STEM programs that are so central to Livermore. You likely know most, if not all of them. First and foremost, Donna Crawford, our board chair. Donna. Michael Carter, here. And directors Kim Budell and Bill Goldstein, both founding members. Thank you. Our room is filled today with many more familiar faces, community leaders, as well as current and retired lab employees. In addition to our moderator and lab directors, we're also honored to have a very special guest with us today from the Department of Energy, who I'll be introducing shortly. First, I'd like to acknowledge a few more folks in the room. Former Livermore Mayor John Marchand is here with us today. And I'll briefly introduce some of our current elected leaders and their staff who have joined us. Representing Assemblymember Rebecca Bauer-Cahan's office, Caitlin Keeshan. Hopefully she's on her way, if she's not here yet. I didn't get a chance to say hi to everyone at the door. From Senator Steve Glazer's office, Jennifer Rizzo. Hi, Jennifer. From Congressman Eric Swalwell's office, Mallory DeLauro. Alameda County District 1 Supervisor David Halbert, who is probably en route from his earlier event today. From the City of Pleasanton, Mayor Carla Brown. Thank you for being here. And current elected leaders from our hometown, the City of Livermore, Vice Mayor Gina Bonanno, and Mayor Bob Warner. Thank you for being here. In honor of the lab's anniversary and today's event, these leaders have brought many wonderful commendations that we've displayed in the front entrance, so I'd invite you all to peruse them at your leisure. Thank you so much for acknowledging this historic occasion with us today, and we're really honored you could be here. Hopefully you've had an opportunity to visit some of the lab displays that we have around the room, as well as some of the historic photos that were on display in rotation on the screens, and some of our special portraits that the lab shared with us today. Thank you very much to NIF and Photon Science, Weapons and Complex Integration, and Global Security. We appreciate the lab employees who've joined us from all of those programs to chat about their many accomplishments today, and we invite you to spend a little time with them after the formal program ends today if you haven't had a chance to. I also want to express our gratitude to the lab's public affairs team and communications for all of their assistance in making today possible. We are, as you may have noticed, recording today's event. Thanks to our colleagues at Lab TV and to AV Images for your help with this today. And we'll be sharing the discussion with lab employees, sharing it with the lab archives, and also putting it on the Foundation's website as soon as it's available. So if you miss something that someone said today, don't worry. It will be recorded for all of history. No pressure. So finally, our formal program is set to go until 5:45. We know this is a long time to ask you to sit, so please know that we'll be replenishing food and drink throughout the program. You should feel free to get up and help yourself at any point to replenish. And now, I'd just like to take a moment to both honor and thank Uncle Credit Union, our exclusive sponsor of today's event. Uncle has been please, yes. Uncle has been celebrating their own anniversary over the past few months, 65 years of tremendous support to our community, and it is thanks to their incredible support that we've been able to provide today's event completely free of charge to all of you. So thank you so very much. Really appreciate it. We have 2 tables of Uncle employees here today, including Chief Executive Officer Harold Browntree. Hi, Harold. As well as Uncle's chair of the board, Chung Bothwell, who also, as many of you know, happens to be a longtime employee of the lab. So Chung, thank you so much. We welcome you now to say a few words.
Thank you, Sally. It's my privilege to be here today as both the chair of the board for Uncle Credit Union and a 39 years employee of the Lawrence Livermore National Lab. As Sally mentions, this is our 65th year of operations, and it all started when 4 physicists at the lab decided to pool their assets to create a cooperative that could serve all lab employees. So as you can see, not only were lab employees focusing on new ideas in the world of science and engineering, they were also thinking outside of the box when it came to financial management. They were very well-rounded, to say the least. We are grateful to those 4 employees for their innovative thinking and our long-standing relationship with the lab. And now the Livermore Lab Foundation is extremely important to us. Each of our organizations operate in a unique space: science and technology, philanthropy, and financial services. Yet, we also share an important common goal: to make our community, state, nations, and the world a better place. The Uncle Credit Union family now boasts more than 33,000 members and more than $689 million in assets. So on behalf of our employees here today, as well as the more than 100 employees working within our organizations, we offer a heartfelt congratulations to Lawrence Livermore National Lab on 70 years of making the impossible possible. We also salute the Livermore Lab Foundations. Thank you for creating new opportunities to support the lab's outstanding work. It was our pleasure to serve as today's exclusive sponsor. Enjoy the program, and thank you for coming.
Thank you so much, Chung. We're so grateful for your partnership with Uncle. As I mentioned earlier, we are honored to have a very special guest with us today from the Department of Energy, the Undersecretary of National Security and the Administrator of National Nuclear Security Administration, Jill Ruby. She served in this position since July of 2021 and has an exceptional 30-year background in science, engineering, and national security, including serving as the director of Sandia National Laboratories. We're so pleased that she was able to join us today and this afternoon for this historic panel. Please join me in welcoming Jill Ruby.
Well, good afternoon. What an honor to be here with all of you and to celebrate this important event. I just want to say, Donna said, just be really fast. So, look, Lawrence Livermore is a very special place. You all know that, and that's why you're here. But just a few things on my thoughts on this laboratory and its 70th anniversary. The first is, which I'm sure you're going to hear from all the panelists today, is this is the place of big ideas. It has been. It needs to continue to be. And despite the way we behave sometimes in DC, it's what we expect. Turning those ideas into reality, I guess I do think sometimes we do the possible also, but we do the impossible together, and this institution is so important. The second thing I'd like to reflect on is 70 years. You know, it's long, but it's not that long. And I think we think, like, these labs have always been here, right? But yet, they've been here, you know, about the same time as a lot of us. We have to take care of them. And I think that that's a responsibility that we all share, and Donna and all the other people involved in the Livermore Lab Foundation is helping make that a reality. But it's so important, these institutions. I wish I could talk about it all day and tell you all the things we're doing, but we need to take care of these institutions. They're really special places, and 70 years really isn't that long. We got to keep it going for a long time. And finally, I just want to thank all of you who have been part of this laboratory and made contributions to the laboratory. I was going to say I don't think anybody gets rich working here, but now I'm not sure, you know, after the uncle thing. But in fact, you know, many of us, maybe most of us, could do better working at other places financially, but yet we choose to be here, and we choose to be here because not only do we get to do fun work, but we get to do it with great colleagues, and we get the sort of internal satisfaction of really making a difference. And so thank you for all the current employees, the retired employees, and others who are here to cheer us along for making this such a great place. And over to my friends and colleagues.
Thank you, Jill. I'm so glad you're here. It's great to see you. We're all grateful for what you're doing, not only for Livermore and Sandia, but what you're doing. Your great efforts in Washington. We need your help, so we support your efforts. Thank you very much. And I would like to announce that the Alameda County Supervisor, David Halbert, did just arrive, so I want to acknowledge his presence. Thank you, Dave, for coming. And now for our main event. As Sally shared earlier, my name is Donna Crawford, and I'm very proud to be one of the founders and board chair of the Livermore Lab Foundation. After retiring as Associate Director of Computation in 2016, it was important to me to showcase the lab's capabilities, accomplishments, opportunities, and that's why I'm so pleased to see so many of my fellow retirees and current employees today, you know, because this anniversary celebration is truly about what you all have accomplished. You know, without the brilliant scientists and engineers, innovative researchers, dedicated administrators, support staff, none of the achievements over the last 70 years would have been possible. So at its core, the lab's about its people. And it's about that team science approach that E.O. Lawrence believed in. When we work together, harnessing science in the national interest and for the greater good, that's when the impossible truly becomes possible. Our panel of laboratory directors are the people who led that charge, and I'm thrilled they've been able to join us today. After their formal remarks, we hope there's time for a short amount of questions from our audience. And if you have a question you'd like addressed, there are index cards in the center of your table. Please jot down your question, and our development associate, Emily Pizzuti, will be going around to collect them right before the end of the program. So I'm delighted that the Honorable Ron Lehman, Ambassador and Counselor to the Lab Director, has agreed to be our moderator. He simply is the perfect person to do this. Ron has held key positions at the Pentagon, the White House, the State Department, the Department of Defense. He's been a trusted member of the Lab Directors Core Team and has served for many years as the director of the Center for Global Security Research. I encourage you to read his complete bio on page 4 in the program. It's impressive. Ron hit the ground running to prepare for today's event with significant research, thoughtful questions, both well-known and obscure facts. I think you're going to find them fascinating, and I know it will all lead to a very spirited dialogue with our great stories from our directors. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming my friend and colleague, Ron Lehman, and all the directors.
Thank you, Donna. All I have to do is look down this row and realize what a very special day this is in the history of the lab. Our panel members were directors of the lab for over 2/3 of its history. There isn't a day in the history of the lab in which at least one of them wasn't an employee. So we've got it completely covered. They're fully qualified to talk about the good old days, the dark times, but more importantly, to help us get some insight into the future. I suspect I was asked to be the moderator because actually, over the years, I worked with or for every director of Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. Beginning in the 1970s, when Harold Brown was Secretary of Defense, Roger Batesel was actually lab director, Herb York was at the State Department negotiating an early version of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, Edward Teller was at the Hoover Institution, where I used to have coffee with him, where we were both fellows. I think that you have bios for all of the members. I will give each of them a brief introduction. We will go in chronological order. Apparently, I'm about at the right distance from the mics. The mics are automatic. So let me begin by introducing Dr. Johnny Foster. Johnny was one of the original employees of the lab. When Harold Brown went back to the Pentagon to be DDR&E, Johnny became the lab director. When Harold left to be Secretary of the Air Force, Johnny went back to be DDR&E. The relationship between the lab and the Pentagon is an interesting one, but Johnny's goes back to working on radar in combat on B-24s in World War II. So, Johnny, you can start us off.
Well, thank you, Ron. Welcome everyone to this joyous occasion in which we celebrate 70 years of the founding of the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory. And I'm happy to be here among my colleagues, collaborators, and friends who have all contributed to the lab's illustrious achievements. I'd like to just take a few minutes to describe the impact that Ernest Orlando Lawrence had on all of us. For some in this room, they knew him directly, but his impact has been huge, even for those who came later. Lawrence was a family friend. He was a colleague of my father, chair of the physics department at McGill. My father collaborated with Lawrence at the Berkeley lab on both the cyclotron and the Stark effect. So as I first met Lawrence, I knew to be respectful, and I wanted to impress him. He helped shepherd me through my PhD and also recruited me to join the new lab at Livermore. Ernest Lawrence extended leadership, persuasion, judgment, and vision. These skills were paramount for the founding of the laboratory. They directly enabled the recruiting of the old-timers here tonight. But they also taught each of us how to do it the Lawrence way, and that worked. For myself, I credit these early days at Berkeley and the Lawrence Livermore Lab at shaping whatever skills I took forward afterwards, and for that, I'm eternally grateful. A few personal notes on Lawrence's admirable qualities. Vision. He taught me to survive what you believe is the right thing, even if others disagree. Persuasion. You can have the vision, but you must do the work to convince others on the strength of your arguments. The challenges in persuasion are found to found the laboratory are well known, especially when the existing nuclear laboratory did not want the competition. But another important lesson I learned from that experience, competition is good, even paramount. Leadership. Lawrence would walk around at night talking to individuals about their work, their issues, solving problems. Part of the leadership was conveying how important the work was. Part of conveying how new ideas, out of the box ideas, were good to explore. And a supreme part of leadership that Lawrence taught by example. Managers need to know what is going on, including some level of detail, in order to properly lead, which brings out the best in everyone. As we celebrate the lab's 70th anniversary, I think it's important to remember the lab's roots, the important core mission, and the man who made it happen and shaped the next 70 years and beyond. I thank you for your attention. I'm looking forward to getting back to my wine.
Thank you, Johnny. Thank you, Johnny. Next, we will hear a pre-recorded statement from Mike May. Mike and I have a special relationship. We're both former Army paratroopers. We both lived in Vietnam, and we both ran one of the think tanks at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. After Mike May was laboratory director, he went off to Princeton to the Institute for Advanced Studies, where Albert Einstein used to hang out, and came back and thought we ought to have a think tank here. And that was, in many ways, the intellectual origins of our own Center for Global Security Research. So can we hear from Mike May? And because Mike can't be here, I asked him a question, so we'll just go through and hear the question. But that'll give you an idea of what we're looking for when we get to the Q&A and receive your questions. So Mike May.
Came to the lab about a week after it opened in 1952, and I stayed for the next 33 years. So that was the bulk of my career, but it's part of the lab which is quite far back in time. I think some of the things I'll say are still true. The first thing that struck me at the lab was that the top levels, the directors, and everybody else had a combination of commitment and competence, great competence, for the program, and that sponsored a team spirit. It was quite different from graduate school or any school, and different also from other organizations I've seen. And that held through all the 30 years I was here. People knew what they were doing, they knew they wanted to do it, and they were very competent at it. And we all worked with each other. That's another thing that struck me. I started to work on radiation hydrodynamics, a field that really before nuclear weapons applied mainly to astrophysics. And a few of us formed a little group to study the material. Everything was new. To us, the physics were new. The computers were quite new, and in fact, we started with computers that actually made mistakes in addition to our mistakes. That got straightened out eventually. And the whole thing was a far more interesting experience, and one where I learned a great deal more than anything I'd done before. The lab had two other characteristics that I thought were particularly good as I kept working at the lab over the years. One, the lab was able to communicate its ideas and its opinions to all levels in Washington, to the Congressional Committee, to the then Atomic Energy Commission, to the Bureau of the Budget when we had an unusual request. They were willing to listen to us, not only about our current programs, our obligations to the stockpile, but also about new ideas and new programs. That lack of bureaucratic obstacles has been very important. And another feature that I want to mention is that the lab was able to argue for a strong underlying research program. By and large, we're an applied laboratory where our goals tend to be major experiments and new capabilities. But under that, there was a strong research program relevant to the goals. I believe that's still correct. It's more correct than ever, I believe. And that's not always something to be taken for granted in a government-funded lab. So these are the main things I want to pass on to today's employees. I'm very impressed with what I know of today's employees. I think we're going to continue on. The main program when I was there was the nuclear weapons, which were also quite new. Now, I can't say the end of the Cold War anymore. I would say with the apparent remission in the Cold War, the lab has broadened its mission to many other technical areas, and that started when I was there, in fact. So one of the questions that was asked to me was your best piece of birthday advice for the lab. And he's 70 years old, and you're 35. Well, I hope so, and I think in a number of respects it is so. It is true that as one institution ages and the U.S. government ages even more, there's been some accretion of unnecessary bureaucratic impediments, but I think you can fight through them and get the story across. Lab has been an essential part of the United States security establishment and research and development establishment. I think that will continue. So I don't have any other advice. I'd be happy to answer a question or two if we have the time.
Mike, this is Ron Lehman. Sometimes people debate whether E.O. Lawrence or Herb York was really our first director. Certainly, Herb was the first director at Livermore, but we were tied to the Berkeley Lab as well.
Yes.
You were director when the Zinner report came out,
Yes.
and the decision was made to separate the two labs.
Yes.
So, and for the director to be considered like a chancellor of a campus.
Yes.
So, in a sense, one could argue you were the first director of the lab.
No.
Do you have any thoughts on all of this?
Yeah. E.O. Lawrence was definitely the first director and one of the founders of the lab. And it was absolutely clear if you knew Lawrence. After a couple of years, he told Herb, you can call yourself director, Herb York. Herb York was an excellent leader. He and his wife became friends of ours. He was essentially unperturbable on the surface and quite driven and focused down below. He always had a sense of humor. He was a great leader. Another great leader I want to mention specifically, although there were several, was John Foster, Johnny Foster, who's celebrating his 100th birthday next month. Johnny just preceded me. He taught me a lot of what I know about how to lead a laboratory. He had a great knack for it, and he went on to be a great asset to the U.S. security more broadly. So we were lucky in our leaders. As for the tie to Berkeley, it was more formal than anything else. No Berkeley director ever told any of us what to do, but it was good to meet with them and consult. That's about all I have along that line. I will mention of the many interesting experiences I had at the lab, one that particularly stands in my mind. I was in the Pacific Atomic Proving Grounds in 1954 when the U.S. detonated the largest thermonuclear explosion that it ever detonated at 15 megatons. Along with other observers, I was on a destroyer about 35 miles away. And the explosion, when we turned around and looked at it, after the first few seconds, the light covered the entire horizon from 35 miles away before the fireball rose slowly. And I remember Harold Agnew of Los Alamos said that he thought that the leaders of the major countries, or all countries, ought to look at one of these explosions once a year or so. They're a very strong argument for staying out of nuclear war. So there were many other experiences, but we're out of time, so thank you for the opportunity to speak to you. Thank you for, I thank all lab employees, past and present. They were friends and colleagues, and I learned from them. And I wish the new employees the very best. And a happy anniversary to the lab, which was the greatest place I ever worked. Thank you.
Our next speaker is John Knuckles, who had a tremendous impact on my life because he recruited me to come to this wonderful lab. Most of you know John as the godfather of laser inertial confinement fusion, and so you know he must be very happy about the recent achievements at the National Ignition Facility. But it's important to remember that he was our director at the beginning of the second half of the history of the lab, so thus far. And that was at the end of the Cold War and the focusing on non-proliferation. So, John Knuckles, over to you.
Thank you. I would like to begin, Emilia and myself, by wishing you, Johnny, a very happy 100th birthday. I think we're celebrating that today, too. Thank you. Thank you. Johnny has played a very key role in my entire 67 years at the laboratory. He was there at the beginning, and I showed up 3 years later to work for Harold Brown, who was brilliant, as you have heard. And let me take a minute and tell you what it was like to show up at the laboratory in June of 1955. The temperature was 110 degrees, about the same, about the same as now. The difference is none of our offices were air conditioned, only the computer building.
First things first.
Yeah, first things first, and a lot of people hovered over the computers. So they showed me to my office, and since I didn't have a PhD and there was a pecking order, they said, this is the converted ladies' room from this barracks building. So then I met Harold Brown, and I felt better because it was wonderful to work with. But when a little bit later in the year, it rained, the roof leaked, and there were puddles on the floor, including Harold Brown's office. And one day, he leaned back in his chair too far while he was talking to us at the end of the day, and tipped and bumped his head up on the wall and clunk on the floor. And he pulled himself to his feet, and he said, "Notice that was two-stage," which he was in charge of. I met a lot of famous people in those days. E.O. Lawrence used to walk by my door. Of course, he didn't look inside. Nor did John von Neumann, nor did other luminaries. And the only one who looked in was Albert Latter, who was from the Rand Corporation. And for some reason, he had heard something about me, I don't know what, but he would stick his head in and say, "John, here's a quick problem that von Neumann solved in 15 minutes. And he would tell me what the problem was, and the challenge was that by the time he walked by the next way, which could have been hours, he would look in and say, "Well," and in the meantime, I had learned to solve the problem a different and much less beautiful way than von Neumann did. And so, I could do successive approximations. And so I would say 27 or 2 pi or whatever, and he would smile and keep walking. So in about a year, I heard about Johnny Foster, who was running the competing division, the hectaton group instead of the megaton group. And I heard that Johnny Foster was working on making a fusion explosion without a fission explosion. Pure fusion, they called it. And frankly, I was so astounded that I had to meet Johnny, and so Harold arranged for me to go sit in Johnny's meeting for a while. And I was so astonished by Johnny, who always wore a white shirt, and he had to do like this past his face to make a point. And he was an incredible dynamic leader, as you would expect. I was so taken with that problem of how do you make fusion without fission that I spent the rest of my life at the laboratory trying to solve it. And that's part of what led to the laser program and the wonderful news that we've heard recently about the great progress there. I could go on in that vein, but let me shift a little bit. What's really been on my mind in preparing for this meeting, of course, is, you guessed it, fusion. And the question in my mind is, given the very good news we've had and the progress, what is the future? And there's a great difference of opinion. One of our experts says, well, optimism is not a strategy, which is true. But on the other hand, I remember many things that Edward Tiller taught me, and one was, what is an optimist? An optimist is somebody who knows that the future is uncertain and is not yet determined. And since it's not determined, we can change it. And it is our duty to change it. Then he went on to say, a little cuttingly, a pessimist is somebody who is always right and they get no pleasure of it. Edward is also the first one who challenged me when I decided to pursue a lifetime in laser fusion in 1963, about the time that the Russians started their own laser fusion program. Although I didn't know that, I guess I wasn't cleared, or I don't know what Johnny knew that we didn't know, but that was, we had a competitor in Russia from the beginning. What Edward said was, John, if you do that, you'll have to become an expert. Do you know what an expert is? And by the way, he had just offered to do a PhD with me, and so he saw the two in competition. So I said, I know what Bohr says an expert is. It's somebody who has made all possible mistakes. And he shook his head and he said yes. And then I finally thought about it, and I said, Edward, I think we should work on, there's a Cold War going on, we should work on fusion. And he said, he looked at me with a little bit surprised, and he said, John, you will have the delicious pleasure of making all possible mistakes in this field. And that, I think some people would say that's exactly what has happened. And they wouldn't be far wrong. We do learn from mistakes, and we go with it. And that's what made me quite interested in the saying that goes with this meeting here today, when they said making the impossible possible. And I've not been able to forget that from the first time I read it, because I think that's what the laboratory is all about. It's what our neighbors across the street, Sandia Livermore, is all about. And working together, we have accomplished a lot. And the question for all of us is, what are the limits of making impossible possible? For example, should we make the future of laser fusion possible, or has it reached its end? And nobody knows. And I think with that, I'll let somebody else talk. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Our next speaker is Bruce Tarter, an astrophysicist who early in his career put a lot of emphasis on supercomputing, which turned out to be very important because he was the director when we developed the Stockpile Stewardship Program. That was to help deal with deficiencies as a result of the end of nuclear testing. Much of the science and certainly the facilities that we have used for the last quarter of a century were begun during that period. So over to Bruce.
Thank you, Ron, and thank you, Donna, from the Livermore Lab Foundation for hosting this event. It, as I think John commented about the temperature. I think Bruce Goodwin reminded me this morning on opening day of September 2nd, 1952, the temperature was also 112. So it's clear that the weather gods have a particular focus on this place at this time of year. I've added a new thing after listening to John's personal reminiscences, and after hearing Mike May talk again. So when I first came to the laboratory, 1967, there was a thing called the Monday morning meeting, which I think George might have still been here when it happened, but every Monday you would gather the hierarchy of the laboratory, the associate directors, the lead designers in this case, and you would hear a talk. If there had been a test, you would hear a talk on the test. If you heard a topic, it would be really interesting. And so I had written a thesis whose title was the essentially transfer of X-rays through a hot medium, and sounded relevant. So even though they were looking for somebody to fill a gap, and so they said, well, let's see how he can talk about his thesis at the Monday morning meeting, which was a somewhat unusual thing. And so I had no idea what the Monday morning sort of was, so I gave my talk on my thesis, and Mike May was then the director. And afterwards, Mike May came up and said, you know, it was a very good, interesting talk and a good talk, but you talk way too fast. So the coda to this is that after I became director, Mike came up and congratulated me and said, you were a wonderful choice, but by the way, you still talk way too fast. So that's my sort of equivalent, I think, of some of John's reminiscences, and certainly Johnny's extraordinary memories and thoughts about Ernest Lawrence. My role at the laboratory in the last several years has been that of sort of a quasi-historian. As you all know, or many of you know, I wrote a book on the history of the lab. And so I thought I would very, very, as briefly as you can, try to walk through that period of the history of the lab in terms of its eras and epochs, and see if there's some obvious lessons learned that jump out of that. And so, as most of you know by history or by your own reading, that first decade of the 50s, where all of the people who've spoken so far, John, Johnny, and Mike, were there, had to be one of the most exciting, it had to be like being a physicist when quantum mechanics was discovered. It had to be just something just inspirational, exciting, and a wonderful thing. But the thing out of that is that the physics inventions in the period of the 50s laid the foundation for the modern stockpile. There's no question. And in a sense, that was because the people were incredibly creative and didn't know much, as John said, at the start, so they weren't constricted. They also were essentially told to do nothing that looked like Los Alamos. And they followed that to a T and came up with the inventions which laid the foundation for the modern stockpile, and that was the decade of the 50s. The decade of the 60s, that was transformed into the strategic stockpile. There was first Polaris, the first submarine-launched ballistic missile, the various variations of Minuteman, and by the end of the 1960s, this laboratory was the dominant and almost total, depending on how you count bombers, owner of the strategic stockpile of the United States. And any questions about the parity or second-classness of Livermore had vanished. And so by the end of those first 2 decades, there was essentially 2 strong nuclear weapons laboratories in the country. In the 70s, a little bit of complacency set in, and some of the senior people, like Johnny, had left. Harold had left. Herb had left. And so, here's to make a very long story short, essentially the senior leadership said we should pursue the effort in laser fusion, which had been done by John Knuckles, my left, and let's make that into a real serious effort. And what was different about this, always before the lab would hire essentially new PhDs and train them into the weapons program. But for the first time with the laser program, they hired laser technologists, laser engineers, laser scientists, plasma physicists to do work on the laser fusion program. And so a huge bevy of new people entered the laboratory to work both on laser fusion and laser isotope separation. And by the end of the 70s, they were roughly a third of the lab budget. Now, to some extent, the same thing happened in the 80s with strategic defense, because for better or for worse, the laboratory was the principal lab doing the Strategic Defense Initiative during the 1980s. And there were the core nuclear weapon pieces of that, there were beam weapons pieces of that, and there were the Brilliant Pebbles pieces. And that again required us to hire atomic physicists. We hired people to expand the test program who were coming up, and we hired space enthusiasts who worked on all the Brilliant Pebbles. And so even though SDI faded away with the end of the Cold War, that again, as with the laser program, a huge bunch of new people from different places, along with those from the laser program, had changed the culture of the laboratory. It was now mixed cultures, had gone together, and that was an extremely healthy thing, I think, overall. Now, the 90s, as you all know, was stockpile stewardship. And we all know much of that history. We're sort of the core piece of that in terms of age and stuff. And with stockpile stewardship, we obviously, all the labs got experimental facilities. But the overwhelming contribution of stockpile stewardship to the United States and the world was the complete rebooting and rebirth of the supercomputing industry in the United States. The whole supercomputing industry had been dormant from the late 70s until the early 90s. If you look at a plot of Moore's Law, you can fake it, but nothing much had happened during those years. And what led that program, I mean, all three big labs contributed, but Livermore's partnership with IBM was what really created the revolution in supercomputing. And as before, we had to hire a lot of people in parallel computing, in graphics, all the things you do when you're going to do three-dimensional computing on parallel machines. And that revolution took us from something, for those who can do exponentials, like a gigaflop to an exaflop, which is a factor of 1 billion over the past 20 years or so. It is an astonishing thing. We redid the supercomputing industry in the world. So that was the decade of the 90s as part of stockpile stewardship, and it contributed to branches of science. In biology, the number of data, it did all of science by having done that. So those were enormous contributions, and a little bit of that happened after 9/11 in the early 2000s, where we took what was always a very small but very high-quality biology program, and we added the piece of biodefense. So Livermore became a very strong piece of the biodefense part of the country. So that's sort of a summary up until the very early 2000s. And what I have seen, again, from a distance, because I'm not as close, obviously, as I once was, is that the last 20 years have seen a very accomplished laboratory. Good budgets in most cases. Due much to George's efforts, we survived the transition from public to private management and ownership. But what I haven't seen in these 20 years is anything like those revolutions of the laser program, the SDI, the computing revolution, the biodefense. We have achievements, we have accomplishments, but I would like to see, to pick up on the phrase of the day, the possible and the impossible, what we haven't seen is the introduction not just of the programs, but introduction of the new cultures by taking something else, pick up Johnny's comment, out of the box on. And that may be because I just don't see very well anymore. But I would like the people to my right, who are the architects of those last 20 years, to see if those comments have any merit or, in fact, are just due to pure ignorance. So I thank you all very much.
Thank you, Bruce. Our next speaker is Mike Anastasio, pre-recorded. And because he couldn't be here, we didn't want him to escape the abuse that comes from asking questions. So he will also be confronted with some questions. Mike was director here, and then he went to be director of Los Alamos. Now, many people believe that was a major demotion, but in fact, it's just another example of Livermore's leaders being sent around the world to help solve America's national security problems. So here's Mike in his own words.
Well, thanks, Ron, and congratulations to the laboratory for 70 remarkable years of accomplishments, bringing to bear outstanding science, engineering, and technology in support of our country's broad national security challenges. This is a real testament to the past and current workforce who've all had a part to make this happen. And I'd like to say that 25 of my best years of my career were spent as part of this. Livermore has always been ready to take on what's thought to be impossible. Innovate as necessary, with even a few hiccups along the way, and come together to deliver. Whether it was the Polaris warhead early in the lab history, or the shot last year at the NIF achieving 1.3 megajoules, they are representative of so many achievements that we can celebrate. But most importantly, the lab cannot stand on its laurels. This record of 70 years of accomplishment must be extended for decades into the future. We are faced with the concurrent nuclear threats of President Putin, the nuclear breakout ongoing by China, the continued nuclear developments by North Korea, and the nuclear aspirations of Iran. Also faced with a slow worldwide response to climate change and its impacts that are more apparent every year, and with a pandemic for which the world was unprepared, and with the mistrust of science that we see by many across the country. In facing the future, we should never forget that the workforce is the essence of the laboratory. The sample of the employees that I've had the chance to meet and interact with in the recent years have the qualities that give me confidence in the future. That the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory will continue to show the aspirations, passion, excellence, and commitment to meet these challenges and many more to deliver for the country. So let me close with a special thanks to Donna and the Livermore Lab Foundation for hosting this event, and congratulate us all once again. Thank you.
Mike, you weren't the first Lawrence Livermore scientist to be named director of Los Alamos, and you weren't the last, but you were the only director of Lawrence Livermore subsequently chosen to be the director of Los Alamos. So can you give us the ultimate insider's view of the real relationship between these two great physics labs?
Well, I think, Ron, you've said it right. Two great physics labs focused on national security science for the country, having different origins and different cultures, and they approach things in a different way. And that's to the benefit of the country. The fact that we have two challenging ways of thought that can be brought to bear on such important problems that the country faces. And I think that's a great benefit to the country. So I'm proud to have been able to do both things.
Mike, the first 5 directors of the lab were weapons designers. Since then, only 3 were weapons designers, including you. Very few employees will be weapons designers. How much of a difference does it make for the lab director to have that experience?
Well, having knowledge of the nuclear weapons program and the challenges it faces is a benefit for the lab director. But I think we've seen in history and recent times that expertise can be learned and get supported by strong, capable organization at the laboratory. Lab director has to represent all things that the laboratory is doing. And it spans science, engineering, technology, and all the innovation that goes on there, as well as the multiplicity of programs that the lab's involved in. So I think the lab director needs to be conversant in nuclear weapon issues. But I think in history we've had some very successful lab directors who don't have nuclear weapon design experience.
Our next speaker is George Miller. George was a designer and in fact was a key designer on all the Livermore weapons remaining in the stockpile. Importantly, he led the final push to complete the construction of the National Ignition Facility. And as Bruce mentioned, he was the director in the transition from pure UC management to a consortium that became an LLC that included the university. So with that, George, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Ron. Not surprisingly, I figured that my previous speakers would leave me with many different options for what to say. So I actually prepared 2 talks. And I'm going to try to combine them. The first was about what Ron mentioned, and that is the transition from UC to the current LLC. I venture to say every one of the lab directors at some point, some earlier, some later, have had what I would call a crisis that they have had to deal with. I was taught very early on in my life by my father that when faced with difficult situations, what's important are your principles and your values. And so when I decided to lead the lab in that transition, it was based upon a couple of thoughts, which I'll share with you and then move on to my second talk. I saw the transition in many respects as a cultural war that was a battle for the soul of the laboratory, based upon many things that were going on at that time. And fundamentally, I decided to take on that challenge because I wanted to preserve the heritage and values of our founders, Ernest Lawrence, Edward Teller, and the University of California. There are many elements to those principles and values that I could talk about, and that's what the rest of this talk was about. But I'd just like to mention 3. The first is that the lab's motivations are based on integrity and public service to our country, not fee or profit. That's something that came from the UC, and I can remember many times when Mike and I had vigorous discussions with the Secretary of Energy about what motivated the laboratory. The second is that the most important service the laboratory can offer the country is by continuing to focus on big ideas and big challenges. And again, you've heard that. In my view, that's part of the heritage that came from Edward and from Ernest Lawrence. And finally, every laboratory employee, in my view, is part of the soul, the spirit, and the driving force that has allowed the laboratory to contribute so much in the service of this country. If you know anything at all, and Johnny mentioned some of it, about Ernest Lawrence and how he led, that was an incredibly important part of how he saw this laboratory, and it's part of our culture. And those are things that I thought had to be protected. And that's fundamentally why I agreed to do what I did. With respect to Bruce's challenge, I actually thought about having a whole talk on that. And it was prompted by yesterday receiving the centennial issue of Foreign Affairs. And on the first page of the first article, I'll just read it for you. We stand at the beginning of history. For every person alive today, 10 have lived and died in the past. But if human beings survive as long as the average mammal species, then for every person alive today, 1,000 people will live in the future. We are the ancients. Of the many developments that have occurred since this magazine's first issue a century ago, the most profound is humanity's ability to end itself. From climate change to nuclear war, to engineered pandemics, to uncontrolled artificial intelligence, to nanotechnology and other destructive technologies not yet foreseen, a worrying number of risks conspire to end humanity. The article then goes on to say, if we act wisely, the coming century will be defined by the recognition of what we owe the future, and our grandchildren's grandchildren will look back at us with gratitude and pride. Now, what this article listed was a series of individual things. My vision or my view is it's actually the integration of all of these things that's the problem. That's the challenge. And without going into a great detail, I will submit to Bruce and challenge the lady at the end of the table that that's the problem we should be taking on. The integration of all of these things. Many places you'll find discussions that we're in the midst of the 4th or 5th industrial revolution. All these things are coming together, and they're coming together in the commercial world. And the fact of the matter is the speed of relevance of this laboratory and of the entire United States national security enterprise is incompatible with the speed of relevance of what's happening. So it's going to require an integration of those technologies and those issues and those subjects, along with creation of a really effective partnership with Washington that allows us to operate at the speed of relevance. So, 2 short insights. I had a longer talk on each that if you catch me afterward, I'll be happy to give you the whole thing. But you get the idea. I think we have a huge challenge in front of us, and I personally believe that this laboratory can contribute in major ways to the solution of these problems for the betterment of the country. Thanks.
Our next speaker is Parney Albright. Parney now runs the HRL Laboratories, which are the historic advanced research laboratories that were established by Howard Hughes. They're currently owned by General Motors and Boeing. But Parney, before he came to the lab, had extensive experience with the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House and was Assistant Secretary of Homeland Security. And while he was director of the lab, it was a period in which the nation was looking to the labs to provide broader technologies for a wider range of national security challenges such as counterterrorism. I'm very pleased that Parney was willing to leave his laboratory, which is in the hills just above Malibu Beach, to come up here and enjoy our weather. Parney, thank you, and over to you.
Well, thanks a lot, Ron. Yeah, actually, I do believe I have the best view of anybody in the aerospace business. I look right out over Tom Hanks's place, but anyway, it's pretty nice. So I had written out a talk, and I'm going to riff a little bit on it based on some of the things that everybody else here has said, particularly both Bruce and George. But I'm going to come at it from a little bit different perspective. So the topic today that I was told to address is what's the future of the lab? And as I think everybody here knows, I was not of the lab. I did not come to Livermore. I came to Livermore pretty late in my career, actually. I did not come to work here as a junior scientist and kind of work my way up through the system. So I don't have any great, actually, one thing I would say is I think I'm the first and perhaps only lab director that A, never met Edward Teller, and B, wasn't in the UC pension system. So, so with that as sort of a background, let me just first by stating the obvious. Right now, the entire nuclear weapons complex is engaged on an intense program of life extensions and modernization. To be honest with you, I first saw that program laid out, I think about 4 years ago, at some meeting in Washington, and I was absolutely convinced it was unexecutable at the time. I'm looking at Jill. I'm not sure it is executable still, but nevertheless, I really don't know where things are. But there's absolutely no doubt that the paramount focus for this laboratory has to be on execution and on operational excellence going forward. And I really do not envy Kim that task. But all this modernization work is going to come to an end at some point. And when it does, every weapon that is in this, with the possible exception of one, every weapon that's in the stockpile will likely not have to get touched again for decades. For decades. And yes, it is possible that the world events may cause us to go out and design a no-kidding brand new weapon with brand new capabilities. I mean, not a Lego kind of thing, but something really new. It's also possible that the surveillance programs might pop up something unexpected, and therefore there'll be some work to be done. But the reality is that this is the nuclear weapons program, in my view, is going to come to a steady state that's going to persist for decades. And the problems that will be addressed within that program are not going to be particularly challenging in the sense of attracting talent and attracting investment in facilities. I think that's the challenge that's in front of the lab right now. The scientific stockpile stewardship program has been a wildly successful program. That doesn't mean there's a lot of other, not every question has been answered, certainly. There's a lot of work. The codes can get better. We have exascale computing coming along, and that's going to probably open up new questions. There's a lot of important work being done out at NIF and in other parts of the laboratory and material science. Those are all interesting things. But the reality is that the span of really interesting technical challenges is getting sparse. I mean, things are getting sparse. So the question is, now what? Right? What happens after that? Because this is all going to end probably in about a decade, maybe 15 years or so. So what does the next, forget 70 years, what does the next 20 years look like? And what are the things that have to be true? You have to have mission, and because otherwise you will not attract talent, and you also will not attract investment from the government and in particular from the current government sponsor for this laboratory, which is NNSA. So you have to have a mission. You got to ask yourself, what is that mission? You know, Bruce laid out a litany of things where the laboratory progressively expanded its mission, and it did so in a way where it brought in all kinds of new talent, all kinds of new capabilities, and it must have changed the culture of the laboratory, but you did that under the aegis of a government sponsor that was willing to make those kinds of investments. And it is not at all obvious that sponsor is going to be willing to continue to make investments in areas that are a little bit outside of its primary area of responsibility. And trust me, once the LEPs end, life extension programs end, and the modernization program ends, finding dollars for the nuclear weapons program is going to be challenging, I would say. So where do you go from here? The clue, and actually Mike Anastasio said it, what is the laboratory's mission? If you actually read the mission in the LENS contract, it says strengthening the United States security through the development and application of world-class science and technology to enhance the nation's defense, reduce the global threat from terrorism and weapons of mass destruction, and respond with vision, quality, integrity, and technical excellence to scientific issues of national importance. So there's also I would also add that there's a constraint. Lawrence Livermore, actually George said this very eloquently. we're an FF, Lawrence Livermore, I said we, I slipped, sorry. Lawrence Livermore, Lawrence Livermore is an FFRDC, it's a federally funded research and development organization. What that means is you're motivated by mission. You're not motivated by bottom line, you're not motivated by fee. I mean, like George before me, I would go into the board meetings and I had no idea what our fee was going to be. When I walked in, Tom Giaconda, who was the deputy at the time, I would ask him, by the way, what's the fee? And he would tell me, but I paid no attention to that. And I suspect Bill didn't, and I suspect Kim doesn't either, because that's not what motivates the laboratory. It's not the fee. It is maybe some of the owners of the lab, but the LLC, but nevertheless, it is not what motivates the people who work here. What motivates the people who work here is mission. And so you have to have, but that is a constraint. You can't just go out and just chase dollars. Just chasing dollars just makes you no different than SAIC or a whole bunch of other places. And by the way, you will not do a very good job of attracting talent that way. So a key strategic question for the laboratory has to be, what are the competencies you want to pursue? And more importantly, I mean, again, George made a great point. This requires a very, very good relationship with Washington, D.C. Because the kinds of challenges that the country is facing, particularly in the national security arena, where the threats are almost entirely conventional, and yet there are profound problems in that space that need to be solved. And so the funding for that's not going to come out of the NNSA. It's going to come out of the Department of Defense, or it's going to come out of the intelligence community. It's going to come from those places. And so how do you go about developing a relationship, not only with your primary sponsor, NNSA, that allows you to do that kind of work, but then also with those other places, those other sponsors that want you to, that are going to be willing to make the kinds of investments they need to make to have that kind of enduring capability that comes with being a national laboratory, an FFRDC. So it's not hard to come up with some things. I mean, bio and chem and cyberspace are all big, profound issues. I would also make a point, and this also came up earlier, that the other strength that that Livermore has in particular, and I would say the NNSA labs have, but certainly Livermore, is you have a unique ability to innovate and to create something brand new that is making possible the impossible. But then you also have the ability to take that innovation and take it all the way through the chain and deliver a capability, either for transfer to someone who can make it in volume, or to just, if it's a one-off, to take it directly to the service. There are very, very few places that have the ability to do that. You look at the defense, national security establishment, the big systems integrators, the Boeings, the Northrop Grummans. They're great at taking other people's ideas and fielding them, but they are terrible at coming up with their own ideas, right? And the small companies that get funded by DARPA, places like that, they are very, very good at coming up with really cool ideas, but they have not done the work, right? As Bruce was alluding to, they haven't brought in the engineers and the technicians and all the stuff you need to have in order to transition that technology into something that can actually be fielded by an operational user. Livermore, and I would say Sandia and to a lesser degree Los Alamos, certainly have that capacity. And yet, in this space, all three of the labs, I mean, there's almost 30,000. If you look at the three NNSA labs, there's almost 30,000 highly talented people who are dedicated to mission, who are cleared, who have access to the kinds of information they need to have, and have incredible facilities. And yet all three of them are punching way below their weight, in my view. And I say that as someone who came out of the national the defense, that environment when I came to Livermore. Before DHS, I'd spent most of my time in DOD, and then that's kind of what I do now. And I will tell you that the labs almost never get mentioned, almost never, and that is wrong. So I will just say that the future is there, but you have to decide what are the missions you're going to pursue, and then you got to really commit to them, and that means going and getting the sponsors, getting the investment, and getting the people. So with that, I'll finish up.
Our penultimate speaker is Bill Goldstein, who presided over 6 years of relative prosperity and robust activity, only to have his career capped by a pandemic, for which he successfully kept us going. And we continue to have to manage that problem. And yet, in many ways, I think if you ask about Bill Goldstein's career, it's really shaping the science and the scientific talent at this lab for almost half its existence. So, Bill, over to you.
Thank you, Ron, and thank you to the Livermore Lab Foundation, and happy birthday to the laboratory, and Johnny, most especially happy birthday to you, and many, many happy returns. So I was trying to think about whether my task was to think about how to say the same things in a different way that have gone before, or to as Parney said, I think, or maybe George, pick up Bruce's gauntlet that was thrown down on the ground. And I'm going to sort of interpolate between them, I think. But I'm not sure. So we'll see where this goes. I was going to actually, I think there are many similar things I think that I wanted to talk about, but my starting point actually goes back to around 2002. That's not my career, but my memory, to tell you the truth. When the university was searching for Bruce Tarter's successor, and the vice president for labs at that time, a guy by the name of John McTeague, called in each of the lab senior managers individually, and I was a newly minted physics AD, new, but he very nicely he asked me in for a special audience, and along with each of the other senior managers, asked me if I would apply for the job of director. I said no. He asked me if there was anyone I couldn't work with. I lied and said no. And then he asked me where I thought the lab should be heading. And remember, this is about 2001, 2002 or so. It was the height of the end or remission of the Cold War. Terrorism was very recently, very strongly on the screen. I answered that I thought that it was important for the lab to more strongly diversify, to diversify away from the focus as such as was on the nuclear weapons mission, and grow other sponsors, other missions, other competencies, because it looked to me, and I think many others, as though the nuclear weapons mission was going to be at best static or probably decline. There was a lot of pressure on it. And without missing a beat, he accused me of linear thinking. Now, as it turns out, 20 years later, I think we can agree that he was right. That was linear thinking, and in fact, as has been noted, the mission of nuclear weapons is the paramount one, probably for our nation's security as a whole. By the way, he was dead wrong on some things he really should have known about, which was, for example, who the successor to Bruce was going to be. But that's a story for another day. I think that we're in a situation right now, and Parney said this very eloquently, where, in fact, what's required is some really nonlinear thinking. We are in a situation which looks very clear at the moment, as in some ways it did then, but where if you look closely or think hard about it, some genuine changes are probably in store for us. So I decided to try to do some nonlinear thinking for this presentation, but it turns out it's hard. And I was not particularly successful at it. I think not as successful as George was, who gave you, I think, a good flavor, more than better than anything. I had something here, better than anything I came up with. So that's probably a good starting point. However, and here again, I'm going to echo some of the things that have come out from the panel. The lab has been singularly good at nonlinear thinking over the years, and this is something that forms a strong basis for us. Whether it's, and again, these things have come up, but whether it's diving into lasers soon after they were invented and ICF, the move into actually twice into computers, and into genomics, the genomic actually being there at the start of the genomic revolution more recently, and actually, Bruce, this is an example of something which I think started after the 2000s, additive manufacturing, which is I think is an area which the lab has genuinely taken a leadership role, certainly within the programs, if not more broadly than that. And again, represents a bit of nonlinear thinking of getting in at the ground floor, if you will, another way of referring to this kind of thing. And the lab has done this over and over again. I think it's particularly important now for the lab to take on this challenge of thinking about the future. Now, I think we're actually in a fairly good place where the lab, I shouldn't make the same mistake. The lab, I think, is in a fairly good place to engage in this kind of nonlinear, out-of-the-box thinking. As been mentioned, I mean, we're in the midst, we have weapon systems to deliver. The lab has healthy budgets, real work to do, missions that are very attractive to people. The successes at NIF, leadership in high-performance computing, and really at the bleeding edge of computing beyond what we think of as high-performance computing, and I believe a legacy of operational and executional excellence right now. Things that stand us in a very good position to take advantage of this moment and look to the future. Now, I sometimes think that I had some real successes as lab director, but if I, am real honest about it and think hard about it, generally speaking, that was a matter of continuing, perhaps, growing the tremendous work and of my predecessors, and frankly, standing on the always superb, committed and hugely consequential work of the lab's employees across the campuses. But I don't think it was a complete slump. And so I'd like to end this actually with something I think was for me a somewhat nonlinear thought or start of something. It's not something I thought of. It's very few things that we think even the things we think we thought of, we generally didn't think of. But I'm referring actually to the Livermore Lab Foundation, which was founded, under my stewardship, I would say, at the lab. It was actually, I think, a very nonlinear idea. It was Donna's idea, and Donna came to me with it, but I think it was, saying yes was not a linear thing to do, let me put it that way. There were no such things, really. I mean, Los Alamos had something, it wasn't really like this. There were no such things in the weapons arena, really not much of us in DOE either. It really was a new idea. It wasn't quite fully baked. It wasn't clear it would work. In fact, there were many arguments why it wouldn't work. There were interesting discussions with the department and with the field office. I believe Donna took care of those for me. It was, but nevertheless, it's here still. We're all here, and not only that, but other labs started to do it after we did, and the Department of Energy itself decided it was going to have its own foundation. And all of that grew out of, I was there, all of that grew out of Livermore starting to go down this path. And while I think it's still challenging, it's frankly, a weapons laboratory is a tough sell sometimes to the philanthropic community. But through some very, go figure, through some very clever work with partnering with other philanthropies, and focusing on educational opportunities, particularly for underadvantaged students, and with a focus on diversity. The foundation has been, I think, done amazing things. And as the former director, I think many of those, most importantly for the lab, including contributions to the lab's diversity and outreach, actually enabling the lab to start new programs based on work that was kicked off by partnerships within the philanthropic community. So that seems like a perfect place to end. So with that, I will step away from the microphone. Thank you.
Our next speaker is our current director, Kim Bodil, who has the challenge of following 8 previous hard acts to follow. Kim is in some ways symbolic of generational change, even though she's actually been associated with the lab for several decades. But the real embodiment of generational change is that she has to recruit a major new group of talent, young talent, to the laboratory, that we are going through generational change. And she's focused on making our science bolder and making our performance better, but I'll let her speak in her own words.
Thanks, Ron. I was thinking as Bill was talking, I've spent a lot of my career in the unenviable position of being the next speaker after Bill Goldstein, so thanks for that. I appreciate it. So hopefully I'll achieve some level of humor. I always rate my talks on whether or not you laugh at my jokes. So I am very lucky to be the 13th director of Lawrence Livermore National Lab, and to follow in the footsteps of some really tremendous visionary leaders who've created just an amazing institution. And I really do resonate with the comments that have already been made about the role that the lab plays, the unique role that this laboratory plays in not just the nuclear weapons enterprise or the national security enterprise, but the US science and technology enterprise. And if you look at the legacy of innovation that our lab has put out into the community, it really is quite extraordinary. And many of those accomplishments have been mentioned here, but revolutions in fields far from our core, like laser technology, inertial confinement fusion, biology, computing, climate, many of the most salient questions that we're looking at today. So I thought I'd just spend a few minutes. I felt it was a fool's errand to write a speech if I was going to follow 8 lab directors. I figured I'd have to build on what they said. Tell you a little bit about how I think about the lab and where we're going, because I really do think we're at a really important transition point in many, many directions. So things are changing very fast. The national security situation 30 years ago looked to be changing very fast in a direction that was remarked earlier would take our core mission quickly to be not salient. And that situation is dramatically turned around. So there's not a person certainly in Washington today, who doubts that nuclear issues are at the forefront of national security challenges in the United States. Where we once thought we were moving to a world of cooperation and unprecedented peace and global security, we're now sitting in a situation that looks like the Cold War, only more so, because we have more than one peer adversary and very rapid development going on in other countries in their nuclear deterrent posture. On top of that, the science and technology arena is changing faster than ever before. So the pace of innovation is just unprecedented. So the US's advantage, which has always been to be more innovative and to be out in front, has a new degree of difficulty added to it. Part of being out in front means you just plain need to be moving faster than anybody else. We're also going through an enormous demographic change at the laboratory. You know, at the end of the nuclear test era and the beginning of the stewardship era, it was noted that over some time scale, turns out it's just about 25 years, the last experienced folks from the program would be retiring. And so on top of the wave of retirements that's coming to fruition right now, we had after 2 years of global pandemic, people are reassessing their prospects. The workplace is changing in very fundamental ways. Employees' expectations for what their careers will look very different. Today, more than 40% of the lab's employees are less than 5 years at the lab. And it's exciting, but it's really quite different. And a number of really important challenges face the lab. So what is Lawrence Livermore National Lab? We're a national security lab with a nuclear core. If you look at our budget by dollars, 2/3 of our budget derives from the nuclear weapons mission from NNSA. That doesn't define everything we do, but it does set the topography of the lab. It tells us what we need to be good at. It tells us what kind of people we need. It tells us what the major capabilities and facilities are we can steward. And it gives us opportunities to apply those capabilities across the full national security space. And when I say national security, I really mean the full space. That's true national security missions like nuclear weapons and conventional munitions and other defense-related topics. That's also climate and energy. It's countering threats from weapons of mass destruction. It's thinking about competitiveness in a new way. Science and technology is not just something that we enjoy doing. It's a competitive advantage for the United States, and it's a national security imperative. There are fields where we need to be leaders because they're so strategically important. So working across that full space with this immense capability base that our core program has built for us is really an exciting opportunity for the lab. So this year is our 70th anniversary, and we've spent a lot of time talking about our history and the legacy you heard described earlier. Not out of nostalgia, but to really imbue people with that sense of possibility, of technical ambition, and of urgency. I think the speed of relevance that George described is really a great way to characterize it. Our mission is very important, it's very salient, and we need to act like it. We need to move with great speed and urgency to address these important problems. So I asked the senior leadership team 2 questions. If we look around the world today and ask ourselves, what are the most important defining challenges that the country and the world face today for which we have something really unique to contribute? And the second question is, what is the biggest impact we could envision having if we were not kidding? We're really gonna do it. We're gonna go all in and bring the whole of the lab together around these issues. So we defined 4 areas that we're really focused on today. The first one is the transformation of the stockpile, the nuclear weapons stockpile, and the nuclear weapons enterprise. We've spent 30 years waiting for a national consensus around the path forward, and we have it. Livermore is right at the heart of this transition from caretaking the legacy stockpile to thinking about the future, positioning the deterrent for the 21st century, and helping an enterprise which hasn't had to do this kind of work for a very long time, not just reinvent old ways of doing business, but create an entirely new way of thinking about the entire life cycle of the nuclear weapons stockpile. So we're prepared to respond to what the nation needs, not just today, but 20 years hence. When I came back to run the weapons program, the one thing I didn't want to think about was production. And I will tell you, I've spent 4 years thinking about nothing but production. So, this revolution in additive manufacturing, turns out that's a thing, and it's a good idea. The second challenge is around the threat that we've been living through for the last 2 years. How do we make our country and the world more resilient to bio threats, both naturally emerging and man-made. 10 years ago, we had this great idea that you could use high-performance computing to really speed up the way we design drugs and therapeutics. And while everyone agreed it was an important problem and someone should work on that, it was really hard to get focus in the government on that as an important issue. It turns out it's not a problem anymore. After 2 years of living through this pandemic, we've proven that there's a possibility to take what is normally a 10-year process, where 90% of the drugs that start at the beginning of that pipeline will fail, and bring those timelines down to less than a year, maybe less than months, down to weeks. This last winter, we did an exercise where we were able to redesign antibodies to counter new variants of COVID over the span of 2 weeks. It then went off for testing, and within 4 months, there were new antibodies that were prepared to go out into the market. So that is an area where we really need to lean in and create this new way of thinking about biology, and again, through a national security perspective, since this is really an area that has immense potential. The third one is the fact that we're living through an unprecedented evidence of the impact of climate change in our environment. So how do we make our nation able to adapt to the changes we're already seeing and to mitigate the changes that are coming? So this lab and some of our former leaders, notably the one to my left, had a great idea to focus on carbon. Not just how do we reduce emissions or how do we understand how the climate system works, how do we think about removing carbon dioxide from the environment? If we stopped emitting today, it wouldn't matter if we can't remove some of the carbon dioxide we've already put into the environment. So we're focused on taking all of our formidable understanding of the climate and taking it to a next level where we can help communities understand what the impacts will be in their local region with our high-fidelity climate models, taking the technologies we know about that can mitigate climate change and can take carbon out of the environment, everything from using deep-rooted plants to sequester carbon in the soil to direct air capture and carbon sequestration, and taking those out into the community to see if we can begin this transformation. And with the support of the Department of Energy, I'm really optimistic that we can build the kinds of partnerships and programs that will allow us to do that. And then the final one is sort of related to what Parney talked about. If you think about the state of play in a conflict today, it doesn't look very much like conflict did 30 years ago. So the fact that the first round of threats play out in cyberspace, for example, is a very new challenge. The commercialization of space and the lowering of barriers for people to put assets in space really changes the game when you think about national security. The fact that there are all sorts of new technologies emerging in the defense space, like hypersonics and directed energy weapons. How can the US think about deterrence in a new way and in a more holistic way so that we can achieve asymmetric advantage, not by being bigger or having more, but by using our assets more smartly? So this concept of integrated deterrence and technology competition is a big focus for the lab today. So I'm really excited about the future. I think I have the best job in the world. I think, like every director thinks, I'm sure, I'm here at just the right time. This is definitely the most important epoch in the history of the laboratory. And I get the challenge of leading us forward with just an incredible group of people. I mean, what has always been true at the lab is that extraordinary people come and join our team. And if you give them the opportunity and the tools, they will do amazing things. So with that, I will turn it back to Ron.
All right. The audience has submitted a large number of questions, and we don't have very much time. So what we're going to do is invoke the practice that's common in congressional hearings, and that is to say that we will ask a few questions, and then the rest of the questions will be submitted for the record, and we will force our panel members to answer them. Let me begin with our first question. Kim has to recruit a sizable percentage of the lab in new people. E.O. Lawrence had to recruit 100%, and he recruited people like Johnny Foster. So in recent years, the lab gets all these awards for being a wonderful place to work, and yet we're worried about our STEM recruitment and other recruitment. So the question is, how do we attract the best people? What's the problem and what's the solution? Johnny, you knew Lawrence, he recruited you. You want to start us off?
Oh, thank you, Ron. This is a great question. Yes, we are worried we may not attract the best people we need. We should be worried. We live in a marketplace of talented young people, and we are competing against the best employers our country has to offer. Major research universities, excellent companies, from startups to full-size and other national labs. All these folks have the same problem. To compete well, we need to put our best foot forward, seeking out the best talent, selling the great history of achievements of the lab and vision for the future. And of course, we must and can use the product of this meeting. We should study how the other best-in-class outfits recruit and pick the techniques that will work best for us. That's it.
Would any of our other panelists like to pick up on this question of how do we get the best talent? Just give me a show of hands. Kim.
Make one comment. I think we can recruit the best talent because we have this incredibly important, exciting mission. We have all these awesome experimental and computational capabilities. For me, the challenge is keeping these people here, right? I've had a 35-year career at the lab doing many different things, and that's the beauty of a place like Lawrence Livermore. I can't let accede to the idea that folks are just going to come for 3 to 5 years because we want them to learn national security and become part of that family. And so building a system that not only brings them to the lab, but keeps them at the lab and allows them to do that great work over the arc of a career is the most important thing for us.
Johnny?
If I may, I would just like to come back on that. In order to make a sale, to get the best people, you have to package the product. I'll give you an example of the most effective program I've come across. It happened a few years ago, and the person who was involved was Lowell Wood of this laboratory. Lowell had a plan. People were worried about how we can get a better ballistic missile defense capability. And Lowell felt he had the solution. So he put up a question to the subcommittee of the Congress and in that subject. And he said, look, Professor Teller has a proposition to present to you, and would you like to hear it? And of course, the answer is yes. When can you do it? Tomorrow. All right. So tomorrow came, and Edward was there, and he makes a few kind remarks and turns it over to the expert, Lowell. Lowell then describes the concept he has, which is revolutionary, and asks if the committee feels this would be worthwhile bringing forward to the president. And of course, yes, they wanted to do that. Okay, fine, adjourn. then I get a message from Lowell that says, hey, here's what I want you to do. Here's the outline of the program. And since you're on the President's Foreign Advisory Board, and they meet tomorrow, I would request that you take it to President Reagan during his meeting. Okay, fine. So the day comes, I go in and interrupt the council that the president has underway, and he simply says, John, what is it? And I said, this is a request from Dr. Teller for your approval. And he looked at it, read it, and then looked at me and said, and so I go back to Lowell and say, the president said, and Lowell said, hey, it's approved. And it was. And within a week, the president had told the Secretary of Defense he wanted the answer in a week, detailed, and he got it. And we built the program, put it on orbit, and so on. The rest is history. But there is a 2-day performance from startup to finished product. Okay.
Yes.
Bill.
Not to interrupt the applause, but I wanted to give a perspective on this from the other end, as it were, of a recruit who was looking at that program. Essentially, when I was hired to the laboratory, which was 1985, it was into the X-ray laser program. And the attractiveness of that pursuit, the technical challenge, the hard problem nature of it was, of course, part of the attraction, but there was an additional piece to it, which was that, of course, this was a highly secret program, the one looking for ballistic missile defense, or trying to apply it to ballistic missile defense. But, side by side with it, the lab was pursuing this new thing, X-ray laser in the laboratory, something that hadn't been done before, and was completely open and unclassified. And frankly, the ability to work in both of these at the same time, if you will, and to have the open scientific challenge as well as the programmatic one was to me a very strong attractor, and also a very strong characteristic of the laboratory, which I think is one that deserves to be recognized and perhaps applied as we meet this challenge in the future. And I know I'm taking too long, but I just add that one of the things that I've used often in my career, it's about Bruce. It has to do with the hire letter that he got from Edward Teller. He may remember this. But he was he was offered a position at the laboratory in the physics department, I think for $40 a week, which tells you how old Bruce is, to work on astrophysics and applied astrophysics. And I'm quoting, "I'm sure you will understand what I mean." So this was not new with me. This is actually a thread, I think, through the lab's history, one that Edward himself propounded and deserves to continue to be paid attention to. Thanks.
Thank you, Bill. I'm told by my masters that our time is up, but I don't accept that. We're going to ask one more question to all the panel members, and that is, if you go around and visit labs, they give you PowerPoint presentations who say who they are. We say we're exceptional. Why are we exceptional?
Let me, and then everybody else can pile on. Livermore, I think, is unique in my experience. And
Your mic isn't on.
how the hell do I turn? Now there it goes. Let me take a crack at that. What Livermore, I think, brings to the table that is different, certainly different than Los Alamos and Sandia, I think, is this idea that you can really do cutting edge innovation, you know, at sort of the physics level, you know, biology level, whatever. And then you can actually do the requisite engineering that gets it all the way to the end. You know, George was talking about speed of innovation. And if you actually look at what slows things, I mean, there's plenty of crap in the government, we know that, right? But it really is this ability to transition technology smoothly, right? You get to how do you coast through what people call the valley of death and things like that. Livermore really has that ability, and it's there in the other labs, but it's not as, I think, as stark. That's what I would say.
Other comments?
I would just,
Kim?
yes, potentially. Okay. I would just add to that, or maybe a slightly different twist on that. What has always struck me about the lab is the combination of unbounded technical ambition. So, really the willingness to, put the very hardest problems that seem, inconceivably difficult to achieve on the table, which attracts the very best people who really love a challenge to those problems. And then the ability to actually systematically, over time, knock down the barriers and create real solutions to have impact. I mean, it is true that the lab's foundational differentiator is our desire to not just have good ideas, but to make sure they turn into real solutions to important problems. I think that's very true.
Since Kim is my boss, it's very easy for me to give her the last word. So can you join me in thanking these 9 really remarkable people?
Yes.
And I will be really brief. Give me 3 minutes to wrap up. First of all, I have to say that's awesome. I stand in awe of all of you. You are my heroes. And we all here in this room are grateful to each and every one of you for the service that you've given to the lab and to our nation. For my wrap-up remarks, I have a gift to give and 2 short announcements. So first to the gift. So I believe the past is prologue, and that you directors have set the stage for great leaders in the next generation. And the foundation wants to acknowledge both today's historic conversation as well as your legacy to the laboratory. So we spent a bit of time trying to come up with a unique gift that we could give you, something different than the plaques or fabulous bottles of wine, this is Livermore, or books that you've received in the past. And it occurred to us, because the past is prologue, that your ongoing presence, virtual presence, at the lab in the form of a special bench might be the right type of inspiration, both for current and future lab employees. So you can't see it very well, but there's a bench in front of the University of California Livermore Collaboration Center, formerly known as Herzl, on the screen right now. And, we would like to give this bench to you, and who knows, someone sitting on this bench might be inspired, and lead to a next great discovery. Whether this happens or not, we know that we've been inspired by you. And this bench, with all of your names, will be placed in our formerly Herzl, and we hope you'll come sit on it, break it in, and along with your names, the plaque will say, "In honor of the 70th anniversary of Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, the Livermore Lab Foundation salutes your leadership, your strong commitment to national service, and your pursuit of making the impossible possible." Thank you very much. Okay, and now because you've been a fabulous audience and you've been so patient, but wasn't it fabulous? As a special thanks to you, a few fun, I love this saying, winner, winner, chicken dinner special gifts. All right, so you all have a box in front of you with a little wine glass. That's a favor for everybody. Pick up that box in front of you, and if it has a sticker on the bottom with either a T or an S, then you are the lucky winner. All right, of either a 70th anniversary t-shirt, S for shirt. Oops, I forgot to bring up the t-shirt. Dale, would you hold? Dale Sloan will now model the t-shirt. All right, so if you have an S on the bottom of your box, you get a t-shirt, or if you have a T, you get tickets to the Ray DeRoe Speaker Series talk next Thursday featuring how the Golden Gate Bridge was built. And that's 1 week from today, and we thank Nadine Horner for those tickets. And you can pick up your prizes, bring your box with the little sticker, to the foundation table at the back. All right, so, and then finally, if you've enjoyed our program, we hope you'll take a moment to let us know. Sign up for our newsletter, join our mailing list, or, of course, help us advance the great science at Lawrence Livermore by making a donation to the foundation. I think we're supposed to have a 70 for 70 appear on the screen. We want to honor the lab's 70th anniversary by adding 70 new donors. No amount is too small, and of course, no amount is too large. We'd just be grateful to have you as part of our formal member of our foundation family. And I know many of you are already donors, and many of you supported us as a reservation to this event, so our sincere thanks. But for those of you who have not joined our foundation family, and even for those who have, we have a very special opportunity. Not only did Uncle Credit Union sponsor this event here today, they have just told us that they, in honor of our 70 donor goal, that they are pledging to match up to $25,000. So we really want to make that goal. Thank you, Uncle. Inside your program is a donation envelope. You can take it to the back, fill it out, give your credit card there. You can mail it in later. Whatever you want to do, we are very thankful. Thank you for helping us continue our philanthropic partnership with the lab's outstanding science and research initiatives for the next 70 years. So on behalf of the foundation and the laboratory, thank you all for joining us. Please mix and mingle now. I think there's still some food, but certainly have the booths and everything. And happy anniversary, Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. Thank you.